A Manifesto for Cyborgs, Science, Technology, and Social Feminism in the 1980s by Donna Haraway. An ironic dream of a common language for women in the integrated circuit. This essay is an effort to build an ironic political myth faithful to feminism, socialism, materialism, perhaps more faithful as blasphemy as is faithful than as reverent worship and identification. Blasphemy has always seemed to require taking things very seriously. I know no better stance to adopt from within the secular, religious, evangelical traditions of United States politics, including the politics of socialist feminism. Blasphemy protects one from the moral majority within, while still insisting on the need for community. Blasphemy is not apostasy. Irony is about contradictions that do not resolve into larger wholes, even dialectically, about the tension of holding incompatible things together because both or all are necessary and true. Irony is about humor and serious play. It is also a rhetorical strategy and a political method, one I would like to see more honored within socialist feminism. At the center of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. A cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. Social reality is lived social relations, our most important political construction, a world-changing fiction. The international women's movements have constructed women's experience, as well as uncovered or discovered this crucial collective object. This experience is a fiction, in fact, of the most crucial political kind. Liberation rests on the construction of the consciousness, the imaginative apprehension of oppression, and so of possibility. The cyborg is a matter of fiction and lived experience that changes what counts as women's experience in the late 20th century. This is a struggle over life and death, but the boundary between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. Contemporary science fiction is full of cyborgs, creatures simultaneously animal and machine, who populate worlds ambiguously natural and crafted. Modern medicine is also full of cyborgs, of couplings between organism and machine, each conceived as coded devices, in an intimacy and with a power that was not generated in the history of sexuality. Cyborg sex restores some of the lovely replicative baroque of ferns and invertebrates, such nice organic prophylactics against heterosexism. Cyborg replication is uncoupled from organic reproduction. Modern production seems like a dream of cyborg colonization of work, a dream that makes the nightmare of Taylorism seem idyllic. And modern war is a cyborg orgy, coded by C-31, command, control, communication, intelligence, an $84 billion item in 1984's U.S. defense budget. I am making an argument for the cyborg as a fiction mapping our social and bodily reality, and as an imaginative resource suggesting some very fruitful couplings. Foucault's biopolitics is a flaccid premonition of cyborg politics, a very open field. By the late 20th century, our time, a mythic time, we are all chimeras, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. In short, we are cyborgs. The cyborg is our ontology. It gives us our politics. The cyborg is a condensed image of both imagination and material reality, the two joined centers structuring any possibility of historical transformation. In the traditions of Western science and politics, the tradition of racist, male-dominated capitalism, the tradition of progress, the tradition of the appropriation of nature as a resource for the productions of culture, the tradition of reproduction of the self from the reflections of the other. The relation between organism and machine has been a border war. The stakes in the border war have been the territories of production, reproduction, and imagination. This essay is an argument for pleasure in the confusion of boundaries and for responsibility in their construction. It is also an effort to contribute to socialist, feminist culture and theory in a postmodernist, non-naturalist mode and in the utopian tradition of imagining a world without gender, which is perhaps a world without genesis, but maybe also a world without end. The cyborg incarnation is outside salvation history. The cyborg is a creature in a post-gender world. It has no truck with bisexuality, pre-Oedipal symbiosis, unalienated labor, or other seductions to organic wholeness through a final appropriation of all the powers of the parts into a higher unity. In a sense, the cyborg has no origin story in the Western sense. A final irony, since the cyborg is also the awful apocalyptic telos of the West's escalating dominations of abstract individuation and an ultimate self, untied at last from all dependency, a man in space. An origin story in the Western, humanistic sense depends on the myth of original unity, fullness, bliss and terror, represented by the phallic mother from whom all humans must separate, the task of individual development and of history, the twin potent myths inscribed most powerfully for us in psychoanalysis and Marxism. Hilary Klein has argued that both Marxism and psychoanalysis, in their concepts of labor and of individuation and gender formation, depend on the plot of original unity out of which difference must be produced and enlisted in a drama of escalating domination of woman nature. The cyborg skips the step of original unity, of identification with nature in the Western sense. This is its illegitimate promise that might lead to subversion of its teleology as Star Wars. The cyborg is resolutely committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. It is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. No longer structured by the polarity of public and private, the cyborg defines a technological poli based partly on a revolution of social relations in the oikos, the household. Nature and culture are reworked. The one can no longer be the resource for appropriation or incorporation by the other. The relationships for forming wholes from parts, including those of polarity and hierarchical domination, are at issue in the cyborg world. Unlike the hopes of Frankenstein's monster, the cyborg does not expect its father to save it through a restoration of the garden. For example, through the fabrication of a heterosexual mate, through its completion in a finished whole, a city and cosmos. The cyborg does not dream of community on the model of the organic family, this time without the Oedipal project. The cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Perhaps that is why I want to see if cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust in the manic compulsion to name the enemy. Cyborgs are not reverent. They do not remember the cosmos. They are wary of holism, but needy for connection. They seem to have a natural feel for united front politics, but without the vanguard party. The main trouble with cyborgs, of course, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, not to mention state socialism. But illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. Their fathers, after all, are inessential. I will return to the science fiction of cyborgs at the end of this essay, but now I want to signal 3 crucial boundary breakdowns that make the following political-scientific analysis possible. By the late 20th century in United States scientific culture, the boundary between human and animal is thoroughly breached. The last breachheads of uniqueness have been polluted, if not turned into amusement parks. Language, tool use, social behavior, mental events, nothing really convincingly settles the separation of human and animal. And many people no longer feel the need of such a separation. Indeed, many branches of feminist culture affirm the pleasure of connection of human and other living creatures. Movements for animal rights are not irrational denials of human uniqueness. They are clear-sighted recognition of connection across the discredited breach of nature and culture. Biology and evolutionary theory over the last 2 centuries have simultaneously produced modern organisms as objects of knowledge and reduced the line between humans and animals to a faint trace re-etched in ideological struggle or professional disputes between life and social sciences. Within this framework, teaching modern Christian creationism should be fought as a form of child abuse. Biological determinist ideology is only one position opened up in scientific culture for arguing the meanings of human animality. There is much room for radical political people to contest for the meanings of the breached boundary. The cyborg appears in myth precisely where the boundary between human and animal is transgressed. Far from signaling a walling off of people from other living beings, cyborgs signal disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling. Bestiality has a new status in this cycle of marriage exchange. The second leaky distinction is between animal, human, organism, and machine. Pre-cybernetic machines could be haunted. There was always the specter of the ghost in the machine. This dualism structured the dialogue between materialism and idealism that was settled by a dialectical progeny called spirit or history, according to taste. But basically, machines were not self-moving, self-designing, autonomous. They could not achieve man's dream, only mock it. They were not man, an author to himself, but only a caricature of that masculinist reproductive dream. To think they were otherwise was paranoid. Now we are not so sure. Late 20th century machines have made thoroughly ambiguous the difference between natural and artificial, mind and body, self-developing and externally designed, and many other distinctions that used to apply to organisms and machines. Our machines are disturbingly lively, and we ourselves frighteningly inert. Technological determinism is only one ideological space opened up by the reconceptions of machine and organism as coded texts through which we engage in the play of writing and reading the world. Textualization of everything in post-structuralist, postmodernist theory has been damned by Marxists and social feminists for its utopian disregard for lived relations of domination that ground the play of arbitrary reading. A provocative, comprehensive argument about the politics and theories of postmodernism is made by Frederick Jameson, who argues that postmodernism is not an option, a style among others, but a cultural dominant requiring radical reinvention of left politics from within. There is no longer any place from without that gives meaning to the comforting fiction of critical distance. Jameson also makes clear why one cannot be for or against postmodernism, an essentially moralist move. My position is that feminists and others need continuous cultural reinvention, postmodernist critique, and historical materialism. Only a cyborg would have a chance. The old dominations of white capitalist patriarchy seem nostalgically innocent now. They normalized heterogeneity, e.g., into man and woman, white and black. Advanced capitalism and postmodernism release heterogeneity without a norm, and we are flattened without subjectivity, which requires depth, even unfriendly and drowning depths. It is time to write The Death of the Clinic. The clinic's methods required bodies and works. We have texts and surfaces. Our dominations don't work by medicalization and normalization anymore. They work by networking, communications redesign, stress management. Normalization gives way to automation, utter redundancy. Michael Foucault's Birth of the Clinic, History of Sexuality, and Discipline and Punishment name a form of power at its moment of implosion. The discourse of biopolitics gives way to technobabble, the language of the spliced substantive. No noun is left whole by the multinationals. These are their names, listed from one issue of Science. Techknowledge, Genentech, Allergen, Hybritech, CompuPro, Genencore, Syntex, Allelix, Agronetics, Core, Syntro, Codon, Repligen, Microangelo from ScionCore, Percom Data, Intersystems, Cyborg Core, Statcom Core, Intertech. If we are imprisoned by language, then escape from that prison house requires language poets, a kind of cultural restriction enzyme to cut the code. Cyborg heteroglossia is one form of radical cultural politics. It is certainly true that postmodernist strategies, like my cyborg myth, subvert myriad organic wholes, e.g. the poem, the primitive culture, the biological organism. In short, the certainty of what counts as nature, a source of insight and a promise of innocence, is undermined, probably fatally. The transcendent authorization of interpretation is lost, and with it the ontology grounding Western epistemology. But the alternative is not cynicism or faithlessness, i.e. some version of abstract existence, like the accounts of technological determinism destroying man by the machine, or meaningful political action by the text. Who cyborgs will be is a radical question. The answers are a matter of survival. Both chimpanzees and artifacts have politics, so why shouldn't we? The third distinction is a subset of the second. The boundary between physical and non-physical is very imprecise for us. Pop physics books on the consequences of quantum theory and the indeterminacy principle are a kind of popular scientific equivalent to the Harlequin romances as a marker of radical change in American white heterosexuality. They get it wrong, but they are on the right subject. Modern machines are quintessentially microelectronic devices. They are everywhere and they are invisible. Modern machinery is an irreverent upstart god, mocking the Father's ubiquity and spirituality. The silicon chip is a surface for writing. It is etched in molecular scales, disturbed only by atomic noise, the ultimate interference for nuclear scores. Writing, power, and technology are old partners in Western stories of the origin of civilization. But miniaturization has changed our experience of mechanism. Miniaturization has turned out to be about power. Small is not so much beautiful as preeminently dangerous, as in cruise missiles. Contrast the TV sets of the 1950s or the news cameras of the 1970s with the TV wristbands or hand-sized video cameras now advertised. Our best machines are made of sunshine. They are all light and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of a spectrum. And these machines are eminently portable, mobile, a matter of immense human pain in Detroit and Singapore. People are nowhere near so fluid, being both material and opaque. Cyborgs are ether, quintessence. The ubiquity and invisibility of cyborgs is precisely why these sunshine belt machines are so deadly. They are as hard to see politically as materially. They are about consciousness, or its simulation. They are floating signifiers moving in pickup trucks across Europe, blocked more effectively by the witch weavings of the displaced and so unnatural Greenham women, who read the cyborg webs of power very well, than by the militant labor of older masculinist politics, whose natural constituency needs defense jobs. Ultimately, the hardest science is about the realm of greatest boundary confusion, the realm of pure number, pure spirit, C31, cryptography, and the preservation of potent secrets. The new machines are so clean and light. Their engineers are sun worshippers, mediating a new scientific revolution associated with the night dream of post-industrial society. The diseases evoked by these clean machines are no more than the minuscule coding changes of an antigen in the immune system, no more than the experience of stress. The nimble little fingers of Oriental women, the old fascination of little Anglo-Saxon Victorian girls with dollhouses, women's enforced attention to the small take on quite new dimensions in this world. There might be a cyborg Alice taking account of these new dimensions. Ironically, it might be the unnatural cyborg women making chips in Asia and spiral dancing in Santa Rita, whose constructed unities will guide effective oppositional strategies. So my cyborg myth is about transgressed boundaries, potent fusions, and dangerous possibilities which progressive people might explore as one part of needed political work. One of my premises is that most American socialists and feminists see deepened dualisms of mind and body, animal and machine, idealism and materialism in the social practices, symbolic formulations, and physical artifacts associated with high technology and scientific culture. From one-dimensional man to the death of nature, the analytic resources developed by progressives have insisted on the necessary domination of techniques and recalled us to an imagined organic body to integrate our resistance. Another of my premises is that the need for unity of people trying to resist worldwide intensification of domination has never been more acute. But a slightly perverse shift of perspective might better enable us to contest for meanings, as well as for other forms of power and pleasure in technologically mediated societies. From one perspective, a cyborg world is about the final imposition of a grid of control on the planet, about the final abstraction embodied in a Star Wars apocalypse waged in the name of defense, about the final appropriation of women's bodies in a masculinist orgy of war. From another perspective, a cyborg world might be about lived social and bodily realities in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. The political struggle is to see from both perspectives at once, because each reveals both dominations and possibilities unimaginable from the other vantage point. Single vision produces worse illusions than double vision or many-headed monsters. Cyborg unities are monstrous and illegitimate. In our present political circumstances, we could hardly hope for more potent myths for resistance and recoupling. I like to imagine LAG, the Livermore Action Group, as a kind of cyborg society, dedicated to realistically converting the laboratories that most fiercely embody and spew out the tools of technological apocalypse, and committed to building a political form that actually manages to hold together witches, engineers, elders, perverts, Christians, mothers, and Leninists long enough to disarm the state. Fission Impossible is the name of the affinity group in my town. Affinity, related not only by blood but by choice, the appeal of one chemical nuclear group for another, avidity. Fractured identities. It has become difficult to name one's feminism by a single adjective, or even to insist in every circumstance upon the noun. Consciousness of exclusion through naming is acute. Identities seem contradictory, partial, and strategic. With the hard-won recognition of their social and historical constitution, gender, race, and class cannot provide the basis for belief in essential unity. There is nothing about being female that naturally binds women. There is not even such a state as being female, itself a highly complex category constructed in contested sexual scientific discourses and other social practices. Gender, race, or class consciousness is an achievement forced on us by the terrible historical experience of the contradictory social realities of patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. And who counts as us in my own rhetoric? Which identities are available to ground such a potent political myth called us, and what could motivate enlistment in this collectivity? Painful fragmentation among feminists, not to mention among women, along every possible fault line, has made the concept of woman elusive, an excuse for the matrix of women's dominations of each other. For me, and for many who share a similar historical location in white, professional, middle-class, female, radical, North American, mid-adult bodies, the sources of a crisis in political identity are legion. The recent history for much of the U.S., left, and U.S. feminism has been a response to this kind of crisis by endless splitting and searches for a new essential unity. But there has also been a growing recognition of another response through coalition. Affinity, not identity. Sheila Sandoval, from a consideration of specific historical moments in the formation of the new political voice called Women of Color, has theorized a hopeful model of political identity called oppositional consciousness, born of the skills for reading webs of power by those refused stable membership in the social categories of race, sex, or class. Women of Color, a name contested at its origins by those whom it would incorporate, as well as a historical consciousness marking systematic breakdown of all the signs of man in Western traditions, constructs a kind of postmodernist identity out of otherness and difference. This postmodernist identity is fully political, whatever might be said about other possible postmodernisms. Sandoval emphasizes the lack of any essential criterion for identifying who is a woman of color. She notes that the definition of the group has been by conscious appropriation of negation. For example, a Chicana or U.S. black woman has not been able to speak as a woman or as a black person or as a Chicano. Thus, she was at the bottom of a cascade of negative identities, left out of even the privileged, oppressed authorial categories called women and blacks, who claim to make the important revolutions. The category woman negated all non-white women. Black negated all non-black people, as well as all black women. But there was also no she, no singularity, but a sea of differences among U.S. women who have affirmed their historical identity as U.S. women of color. This identity marks out a self-consciously constructed space that cannot affirm the capacity to act on the basis of natural identification, but only on the basis of conscious coalition, or affinity, of political kinship. Unlike the woman of some streams of the white women's movement in the United States, there is no naturalization of the matrix, or at least this is what Sandoval argues, is uniquely available through the power of oppositional consciousness. Sandoval's argument has to be seen as one potent formulation for feminists out of the worldwide development of anti-colonialist discourse, i.e., discourse dissolving the West and its highest product, the one who is not animal, barbarian, or woman, i.e., man, the author of a cosmos called history. As Orientalism is deconstructed politically and semiotically, the identities of the Occident destabilize, including those of feminists. Sandoval argues that women of color have a chance to build an effective unity that does not replicate the imperializing, totalizing revolutionary subjects of previous Marxisms and feminisms, which had not faced the consequences of the disorderly polyphony emerging from decolonization. Katie King has emphasized the limits of identification and the political poetic mechanics of identification built into reading the poem, the generative core of cultural feminism. King criticizes the persistent tendency among contemporary feminists from different moments or conversations in feminist practice to taxonomize the women's movement to make one's own political tendencies appear to be the telos of the whole. These taxonomies tend to remake feminist history to appear to be an ideological struggle among coherent types persisting over time, especially those typical units called radical, liberal, and socialist feminism. Literally, all other feminisms are either incorporated or marginalized, usually by building an explicit ontology and epistemology. Taxonomies of feminism produce epistemologies to police deviation from official women's experience. And of course, women's culture, like women of color, is consciously created by mechanisms inducing affinity. The rituals of poetry, music, and certain forms of academic practice have been preeminent. The politics of race and culture in the U.S. women's movements are intimately interwoven. The common achievement of King and Sandoval is learning how to craft a poetic political unity without relying on a logic of appropriation, incorporation, and taxonomic identification.